السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم تسليما كثيرا أما بعد، قد قال الله تعالى في القرآن المجيد والفرقان الحميد: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم، بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أم كنتم شهداء إذ حضر يعقوب الموت إذ قال لبنيه ما تعبدون من بعدي قالوا نعبد إلهك وإله آبائك إبراهيم وإسماعيل وإسحاق إلها واحدا ونحن له مسلمون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. So inshallah, as I mentioned, we will be discussing Yaqub alayhi salam. We mentioned a couple of things about Yaqub alayhi salam last week, which I will just briefly reference inshallah. The first thing is, Yaqub alayhi salam's name comes 16 times in Qur'an. That's one. Number two, Yaqub alayhi salam's other name is Israel. Israel means servant of Allah. Isra, servant. Il means Allah. So Israel is the servant of Allah. The children of Yaqub alayhi salam, which we know very famously, are 12 children. Inshallah, we'll discuss about them. All the prophets after this came from the lineage of Yaqub alayhi salam. Every prophet after this came from the lineage of Yaqub alayhi salam, with the exception of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. That is why the people of the book are also known as Bani Israel, continuing on from that lineage. We mentioned last week that Yaqub alayhi salam was given the name Yaqub because when he was born, there were twins. His older brother's name was Al-Ais or Al-Isu, however it is pronounced, Al-Ais, Al-Isu, either or. And Al-Ais was born. After him was Yaqub alayhi salam. And it is said Yaqub alayhi salam was grabbing his heel, and that's where the word Aqbun comes from. It means heel. So it means he was grabbing onto the heel of his brother as he was being born. Thus he was given the name Yaqub. Or some scholars are of the opinion that Yaqub comes from Aqiba, and it could mean that he came after his brother. Wallahu a'lam. I've read both things. The second thing, that Ibrahim alayhi salam witnessed the birth of Yaqub alayhi salam. This is just some information, and we learn this from the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Qur'an says, وَوَصَّى بِهَا إِبْرَاهِيمُ بَنِيهِ وَيَعْقُوبُ. That when Ibrahim alayhi salam was giving advice to his children and Yaqub alayhi salam, and then Ya Baniya inna Allah astafa lakum ad-din, what religion are you going to follow? I mentioned a story last week, and I said that this is mainly Israeliyat. Most of the information that we have about Yaqub alayhi salam is from the people, from Ahlul Kitab. Quran doesn't mention a lot about Yaqub alayhi salam. The Quran mentions about Yaqub alayhi salam is that how his birth was foretold in advance. This is when we talked about Ibrahim alayhi salam and the three malaika that came to Ibrahim alayhi salam. At that time, they informed Ibrahim alayhi salam of Ishaq alayhi salam, and they also informed him of Yaqub alayhi salam. Other than that, Quran talks about Yaqub alayhi salam and gives the attribute of him and calls him extremely patient. Something we mentioned last week was that the lineage of Yaqub alayhi salam, the lineage of Ishaq alayhi salam, the lineage of Yusuf alayhi salam is considered the most noble most noblest of lineages. And the reason for this is one time the Prophet ﷺ asked about this, and the Sahaba radiallahu ajma'in said, well, Allah knows best. And he said the most noble of lineages is the lineage as, Kareem, Ibn al-Kareem, Ibn al-Kareem, Ibn al-Kareem. So, one thing we learn from this hadith is that Yaqub alayhi salam was also given the attribute of being al-Kareem. When the Prophet ﷺ went to explain who Kareem, al-Kareem, Ibn al-Kareem, Ibn al-Kareem, who they are, he said that is Ibrahim alayhi salam. Or if we go backwards, he went forward. So Ibrahim alayhi salam, whose son was Ishaq alayhi salam, whose son was Yaqub alayhi salam, whose son was Yusuf alayhi salam. And inshallah, following Yaqub alayhi salam, we will discuss Yusuf alayhi salam's story. And the story of Yusuf alayhi salam is a very emotional, gut-wrenching story. It's one of the most beautiful stories in Qur'an, and inshallah from next week we can start from there. And obviously, as much as we know about Yaqub alayhi salam, most of it is mentioned in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. So instead of mentioning it now, about Yaqub alayhi salam, I will mention those things and how Yaqub alayhi salam went about the sibling rivalry and how he took care of it and how he dealt with losing his son Yusuf alayhi salam for many, many years. Inshallah, we'll discuss that next week. One of the stories I mentioned last week, which I'm going to briefly mention, again, is an Isra'iliyat, and for the most part, it doesn't make sense. To be honest, it continues the trend that is of the Bible. The Bible, when we as Muslims always say this, Anbiya alayhim as-salam are ma'soom. We say it, and maybe many of us, if not all of us, we grew up in an environment, we always recognize the prophets to be the greatest. We always say the greatest prophet is Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. The greatest people after Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam are the Anbiya alayhim as-salam. And from amongst the Anbiya alayhim as-salam, there's Ulul Azam, the great five. And we mentioned them. Ibrahim alayhi salam, and Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Isa alayhi salam, Musa alayhi salam. And then we say the greatest people after them is the Sahaba. So for us, it's already trained into realizing that we don't ever think ill of the Anbiya alayhim as-salam. We don't ever think ill of them. If we read something, and it may seem like to us, why, this much we'll say to ourselves, I may not understand why, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it happen. So there must have been a reason for why Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, let's give an example. Why he married Aisha radiallahu anha at a very young age. We may not need to know why and understand, but we know this much it happened, and if it happened, then this was what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted. There was no wrong done. That's what I'm trying to establish here. And this is important when it comes to our aqidah, because this is what makes us Muslim. When we think of Isa alayhi salam, we don't call him the son of Allah. Why? The Bible can say as much as they want, because it does not befit a human being to say, I'm at the level of Allah. So we can't accept that. Anbiya alayhi salam are ma'soom, they're perfect, they would never disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, let alone consider themselves equal or right there with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the Bible and the Torah are full of stories about the Anbiya alayhi salam in a derogatory manner. This contradicts Islam. So I'm going to relay a story only because it's some information. One of the story was about Yaqub alayhi salam's prophethood. The story very briefly was that Yaqub alayhi salam had a brother named Al-Ais. When Ishaq alayhi salam was getting old, he started losing his vision. He had weak eyesight, and he wanted to make dua that Allah, and it was said according to the Bible, that Ishaq alayhi salam loved his eldest son, Al-Ais, more than he loved Yaqub alayhi salam. And his wife loved Yaqub alayhi salam more than, that was her favorite son. You get it? Everybody has favorites, we don't say it out loud. So, Ishaq alayhi salam wanted to make dua for his son Al-Ais to get prophethood and to have barakah in his lineage, because that was his favorite. So on one occasion, he asked his son to go slaughter an animal and cook it for him and present it to him. When he would eat it, he'd make dua for him. His wife overheard this and then told Ishaq alayhi salam that, why don't you do this before your brother comes back? Or Yaqub alayhi salam. She told Yaqub alayhi salam, why don't you do this before your brother gets back? So he had an animal, maybe he had it in his backyard or whatever. He was able to slaughter his animal, cook that animal, and present it to his father before Al-Ais could come back. Now, having weak eyesight, he thought this was Al-Ais. So he ate the food, he was very happy with his son, and he made dua for barakah and for prophethood in his lineage. Look, an Nabi can make a dua for something, but it is always at the end of the day in the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept it. We know this, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is told in Qur'an, you can't give hidayah to whomsoever you wish. That's in my control. So they can make dua for prophethood, but it doesn't necessarily mean they will get prophethood. The story is weird because after this, when his brother came back, he was very upset because he realized what his brother had done. He realized his brother tried to one-up him, tried to undermine him, try to get the favoritism of his father behind his back. He didn't like it. So he got really angry at him and he wanted to kill him. So his mother, Yaqub alayhi salam's mother, told him to leave this town of Palestine, Canaan, and go to where her brother Laban was. Okay? And so it is said, Yaqub alayhi salam left, and during the daytime he would hide, and during the nighttime he would travel until he made it all the way to his uncle Laban. Now, one thing that I mentioned, and I left it at this last week, was something happened to Yaqub alayhi salam on the way there. What happened was, on one occasion, Yaqub alayhi salam, he went to a place and he went to go to sleep. He took a rock and he put his head on the rock and he fell asleep. Now it is said, again, this is in Qur'an, this is in a hadith, we don't sit there and say have absolute yaqeen, but it's just a way to kind of understand the story, if it's, to the point, it's close to it or not, wallahu a'lam. It is said Yaqub alayhi salam went to sleep, and when he went to sleep, he saw in his dream a ladder-like structure come from the sky down to the earth. And he saw malaika ascending and descending from that ladder. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke to him, gave him glad tidings, informed him of his nubuwah. Wallahu a'lam. When he woke up, and he was also told in the dream that his lineage would settle in Canaan. And we know he did, if you know from the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. So he woke up and he was very happy. He understood what the dream meant. He understood that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was blessing him with nubuwah. So what did he do? And this is where I left it last week. He took that rock, he painted that rock, and he placed it there. And he took a vow, and he said, if I make it all the way to my uncle and I stay alive, if I have the opportunity and I come back to this place, I'll build a masjid here. What was the name of that masjid? What is that masjid? That is what we know today as Bayt al-Muqaddas. He was the first to build it. But then obviously we know in Surah Bani Israel the destruction of it. And then Sulaiman alayhi salam rebuilt it. But he was the first to build it. And this is why he built it in that location. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So now, it seems ajib and strange that Yaqub alayhi salam would do something like this, and this is how he would get his prophethood, and he would run away from his brother, and it just seems strange, and it coincides with how the Bible talks about the Anbiya, like they were normal human beings that would be conniving and slick, and this isn't their nature. Thus, as a Muslim, we don't feel comfortable saying that Yaqub alayhi salam would do such a thing, especially since Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes Yaqub alayhi salam as an extremely patient person. And we know from the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, when his children come to him and try to tell him that his son is dead, he says, فَصَبْرٌ جَمِيلٌ فَصَبْرٌ جَمِيلٌ. So it doesn't seem to befit his nature to behave in such a manner. Nonetheless, wallahu a'lam. He gets to Laban, he gets to his uncle. And again, this is all Israeliyat, so don't get confused and don't consider it yaqeen. He gets there, and Laban has two daughters. One, the eldest, Layya, and the younger one was name was Rahil. When Yaqub alayhi salam got there, he had an interest in getting married to them. So he told Laban that I'm interested in getting, this is just what the story narrates, I'm sure there's many things that happen in the middle. He told Laban his interest in marrying his daughter. So he told him that I want to marry the younger of the two. So Laban said, under one condition, your dowry will be, your meher will be, in one narration it says 7 years, in another narration it says 10 years, that you will serve and you will take care of my farm for 10 years. After you take care of my farm for 10 years, you have fulfilled your dowry, then I will get you married to my daughter. Okay, so Yaqub alayhi salam takes the time out, spends 10 years or 7 years taking care of his farm, and after the 10th year, Yaqub alayhi salam is ready to get married. And so when when the original conversation was that you would marry the younger daughter. But Laban told him it was customary, and what was the rule in that area was that the eldest daughter had to get married first. The younger one could not get married until the eldest one was married. He wanted to marry the younger one, he found her to be more pretty. So he said, okay, I'll marry the eldest one. And he got married to her. But he still had an interest in marrying Rahil. So he told him that I still have an interest. And Laban said, okay, that's fine. Keeping in mind that in their era, in that time, it was perfectly acceptable for a man to marry two sisters. In the Sharia of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this is not jaiz. You cannot marry two sisters. Okay? But in that Sharia, it was an acceptable thing. And this is known, so this is, even if the story isn't true, but that is a fact, that it was acceptable in previous Sharias. So he told him the same thing again. Either is narrated 7 years or 10 years. And Yaqub alayhi salam spent that 7 or 10 years taking care of the farm, and then he ended up marrying Rahil. So now he's married to both of them. 20 years go by. So there's two ways of interpreting this. Either he spent 10 years for each wife as meher, or he spent 7 years for the meher, and he stayed an extra 6 years, nonetheless, thus concluding 20 years. 20 years later, he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and by the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he asked Allah if he could go back home. 20 years had gone by. He'd hoped by now his brother's anger would have been subdued and settled. He's hoping this. So he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if he could go back. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him permission to go back to his hometown. Now there is one story that's narrated, is that when he was going to get ready to go back, at this time, his uncle, Laban, had not accepted Yaqub alayhi salam as a prophet. He did not follow the religion of Yaqub alayhi salam. So, he was an idol worshipper. So his daughter, one of them, it's not narrated which one, took the idol that he would worship, that he left in his house, she took it, and she put it under the saddle of her horse. And Laban went out looking for it. He searched the whole entire caravan, and he could not find it. So she took that idol and she threw it away. Something that was mentioned. Now, in this return journey, this is when Yaqub alayhi salam reached that same place, Baytul Maqdis, where what is now known as Baytul Maqdis. He returned to that place, he found his rock, and he said, I want to fulfill my vow. And he had a masjid built there, and it is said that he named that masjid Eid. What is Eid? What's the meaning of Eid? Allah. Israel, Eid, Allah. And then later on it was named to Baytul Maqdis, and Muqaddas, either or is quoted, and Sulaiman alayhi salam rebuilt it. Now there is one matter that's left of Yaqub alayhi salam, and that is he is going back home, but he knows what he did to his brother, supposedly. So now his brother is still very upset with him. So his brother hears that he's coming back. So in one place it was narrated that his brother was preparing for him to come, and he had 400 people with him to kill his brother. He was still upset to kill his brother. So Yaqub alayhi salam, he found out that his brother is still upset and he wants to kill him. So he made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help him and protect him from the evil of his brother. So it is said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informed Yaqub alayhi salam. First of all, Allah accepted the dua of Yaqub alayhi salam and then informed him to give him some gifts that will soften his heart. Now at this point, Yaqub alayhi salam had become very wealthy. First of all, 20 years, he was just working. 20 years is just working. And also when he left Laban had also gifted him animals. Likewise, at the same time, Laban also gifted each daughter a handmaid or a slave. He gifted each one of his daughter a slave. So Yaqub alayhi salam had a lot of animals with him as he was going back home. So it is said that Yaqub alayhi salam gave 400 camels and this, and what does it say? It said 200 goats, 20 rams, 30 camels, 40 cows, 10 bulls, and 30 donkeys. But only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows if this is true or if he gave even that much. But nonetheless, that is what is quoted. His brother, upon receiving this, his heart got soft and he forgave his brother for what had happened. And it is said that at that point they lived, harmoniously, and they had no enmity amongst themselves. But at that point, when Yaqub alayhi salam had made it back, his mother and father had already passed away. Couple of things that are left about Yaqub alayhi salam is that Yaqub alayhi salam had 12 children. 12 children. Layya, as we mentioned, the older of the two, gave birth to 7 of them. And at the time, Rahil or Rachel, whichever way we want to say it, she couldn't have children. So she gifted her slave to Yaqub alayhi salam. And she gave birth to 2 children. Now, not to be one-upped by her co-wife, Layya also gifted her slave girl to Yaqub alayhi salam, and she also gave birth to 2 children. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala over time blessed Rahil and allowed her to have children. And who are her children? She didn't have any children for a long time. Her co-wife had given birth to 7 children. Her handmaid, the slave girl, had given 2. And the other slave girl had given birth to 2. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He wants to give, He gives in a way you don't understand. Because if you ask her, all that pain she felt throughout that time, she probably felt very miserable. Of course she did. People today, when you try to conceive and you try to have children, how miserable it is for that family. Imagine how miserable it was for her. This wasn't just Ismail alayhi salam being born, one child being born. This was multiple children being born. And so, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed her with Yusuf alayhi salam. And if you think about the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, how handsome Yusuf alayhi salam was, how great of a prophet Yusuf alayhi salam was, then you can only say, I'm sure at the end of it, although she had passed away by the time Yusuf alayhi salam came back, she was happy. Of all the children, mine was the greatest. I got it later. And this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does things. We have to be very patient. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He wants to give you, He gives you when it's good for you. We don't see it. We don't know when. We don't know how. But if you trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then trust that the end result of whatever you get is what is best for you. But that comes with yaqeen. If you can't have that certainty, then as it's happening, you feel doubt. You feel depression. You feel sadness. You feel this and you feel that. That's only human nature. But as long as you keep your trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will always give you what's best for you. And it is also said that she gave birth to another child whose name was Binyamin. Wallahu a'lam. The only other thing that is left is that we know that Yaqub alayhi salam's main propagation was in Canaan, Palestine, and near the end of his life, he migrated to Egypt. Anyone know why? Inshallah, we'll discuss that when we get to Yusuf alayhi salam's story, why he migrated to Egypt. And it is said he went at the end of his lifetime, he migrated to Egypt. It was around, Wallahu alam, it said he was about 160 years old. He had prophethood for about 100 years. So he gained prophethood at the age of 60. So he was a prophet for about 100 years. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Now, one of the things that I want to leave us with, because I like to leave something in our mind so it gets us to want to understand what's going on next week. Yaqub alayhi salam had a child. Child's name was Yusuf alayhi salam. And Yusuf alayhi salam, as quoted in Surah Yusuf, and inshallah we will repeat all this next week. He says, I saw ahada ashara kawkaba. Saw 11 stars, the sun and the moon. And he informed Yaqub alayhi salam that I've seen this dream. Yaqub alayhi salam, recognizing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to bless him, Yusuf alayhi salam, he told Yusuf alayhi salam, don't inform your brothers about this dream. There's a lesson to be learned from here. For all of the youngsters that feel the need to show every favor of Allah upon them, don't. This is what Yaqub alayhi salam was teaching his child. Yes, you see a dream, and I know Allah's gonna bless you with something very great, but don't tell your children. Don't tell your brothers. Why? Because your brothers, the way he explains it, Yaqub alayhi salam explains it, he says because shaitan is your enemy. Meaning, you could have very righteous children, but human nature is such that sibling rivalry is natural. It's natural. And if you see your brother or your sister getting one up on you, getting something, being blessed with something, it's natural for you to feel a certain way about it. Now you have to curb that, but it's natural to feel it. So Yaqub alayhi salam is informing Yusuf alayhi salam, don't tell your brothers, lest your brothers get deceived by shaitan, and then they feel a certain way towards you. And we learn a valuable lesson as a father in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. It is the father's responsibility to check his children's rivalries. When your children have rivalries amongst themselves, it is the father's responsibility to help curb it, to talk to the ones who are wrong, to find out what is going on. Don't leave it to the children to figure it out. Don't leave it to the children. Because if you leave it to the children to figure out, then you will forget that you have left them to shaitan. And look at the grave consequences if left unchecked. What happens? They went as far as to say, Uqtulu Yusuf. They went as far as to say, Uqtulu Yusuf. Let's kill Yusuf alayhi salam. This is now, remember Yaqub alayhi salam informed him not to tell, but what ends up happening is, as children, and we'll leave it at this inshallah, sometimes you tell your child, you give him something. I do this with my kids. Sometimes maybe my son is at his cousin's house, and my daughter is with me, so maybe I'll go ahead and give her a candy, and I'll be like, it's okay, they went there, you're here, just don't tell your brothers. The first thing she'll do is tell her brothers right when they come home. That's the first thing she does. So you can only imagine Yusuf alayhi salam being told, he sees a dream, he's so excited. He doesn't understand jealousy at the point where he thinks his brothers are going to get mad. And at that time, he thinks that if I'm telling my brothers, they might be excited for me. Wallahu alam. And so Yusuf alayhi salam does inform them. Now obviously that jealousy, when you're left to shaitan, can lead one to kill someone. And inshallah we'll discuss that when we get to Yusuf alayhi salam's story next week. Wa akhir da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.